One day a kid brought a bottle of ranch and his friend said, hamster me. And then he held the bottle upside down and the kid went over and went and just got out of a hamster feeder, drank it. In class, my students were calling me BP and I was like, what a horrible, mean thing are they calling me now? And it stood for Big Pimp, which is not the worst thing they've called me. So. One time I saw a student that was sneakily eating things out of his pocket and I said, what is that? And he pulled out a slice of unwrapped American cheese. And he said, it's my pocket cheese. And then he ate it without breaking eye contact. My student told me that I looked like I had an emo phase. And I was like, oh, like I look like I was edgy? And they're like, no, you look like you had no friends. It's rude. I asked my students if there was like an upbeat song that we could play. And somebody suggested Cupcake CPR. I was like, that sounds lovely.
Terrible.
It was terrible.
It was?
Asked a student where their work is, and they said, no, I turned in BOFA. And I said, what's BOFA? One of the girls in my class asked me where the male strip club was. And I said, even if I did know, would you want to know that I know? I had a student that came up to me and asked if they murdered somebody, but they had a signed note from the person they murdered saying it was okay. Is that legal? I said, probably not in this state. My students were constantly hitting on my student teacher and I was telling them they need to stop that. And they said, but miss, she's such a MILF. One of my students came back from taking a fat dump in the bathroom and I said, welcome back. And he said, do you want to see a picture? I said, I do not. No, thank you. Why are you taking pictures of your dumps? And he said, for the group chat. A student asked me who my plug was. I said, Chromebook? I tried to give my students stress balls as like fidget toys, but every single time someone would squeeze the big ball that has like a couple of littler balls inside, one of the kids in class would go, "Ay, papi!" It did not remove my stress. One time the kids were working on Chromebooks and there was a kid looking at his computer and he was like, hey guys, check out this uncircumcised wood. And I came over and was like, and they were like looking at trees. Untrimmed trees. When I was working at a really rural district, students would often look up farm stuff on their computers. And I was like, guys, I need you to just stop looking at cows. Stop it. We're trying to do something. No more cows. And a kid raised his hand and said, miss, ma'am, because they were very polite, I need you to educate yourself that there's a steer. Memory at the end of the year, students are giving some truly heinous gifts. Like that one. Why? We found out students have been taking pictures of teachers' feet and airdropping them around campus. Students started playing a really fun new game called Guess My Fart, where you guess what it's gonna sound like before it exits the anus. And you get bonus points if you can guess what they ate. A student asked during class if it's normal to masturbate. Yeah. One student asked how they could italicize their writing. Cursive. They were asking how to write in cursive. 7th graders took a trip to the Liberty Bell, and when they got there, they all stood in a line in front of the Liberty Bell and said, "Skibbity Bell," in unison. So at least they were engaged. One student declared loudly in class that the head was so bad, they lost feelings for him. There's a guy in my class talking about his gym gains, and one of the girls overheard him and said, boy, you better calm down. You're not even filling out your socks yet. My students came back from a long weekend and I was like, guys, how was your weekend? Did you have fun? Don't tell me anything illegal. And one of my students raised his hand and said, yes, I had a great weekend and I was only lightly arrested at the end of it. After we finished reading Lord of the Flies, I served my students some pulled pork that I had made like myself, and I was really excited to share it with them. And after they had eaten it, one of my students came up and said, wow, miss, I'm really impressed. And I was like, why? And he said, you just seem the type that wouldn't pepper your eggs because it gets too spicy. But this is good. One time I thought I had caught some students selling drugs in my class, and I went up to them and I said, "Hey, what are you doing? What is that?" And he opened up the little foil packet and it was a taco. And I was like, well, now I feel like such a jerk because you were just selling tacos, and let it go. And then I found out later it was drugs in the tacos. Drug tacos. I told one of my students that he needed to actually open his book and read it. And he said, "Don't worry, miss, I'm about to get balls deep in this book." I had a student teacher one semester, and as he was leaving, the other class was coming in, and one of the girls said, "Damn, Walmart Matt Damon can get it." I told one of my students to have a seat and stop talking, and she said I should have a seat and fix my wig because it was slipping. I once had a student that called me Mommy Wolf for a lot of the semester. And he told me he would sit down and be quiet if I just howled with him. One time. Tahini is like a chili lime powder that my students used to eat all the time. And there was one day where a kid cut a line of it on his desk with like his student ID card. And then he proceeded to snort the entire line without breaking eye contact with me. I said, "Hey, why don't you have a seat?" And before even a thought traversed his brain, he said, "Why don't you suck a fat chode?" And then he looked back at me and we made eye contact, and he realized what he had said. And as I reached for the phone, he went, no. A kid wrote me this really sweet note. It said, like, "Thank you for being my teacher. I appreciate all you've done for me." And I was like, so sweet. And they said, yeah. "Can you hold it up like this? I need to get a picture for my other teacher. This was an assignment." Thank you. These two girls were talking about a guy that one of them liked, and she said, "Yeah, he left me on red since last night. It's ridiculous." And then he texted her back during that class, and she responded after about 10 minutes. But after she responded, he responded very quickly, and she said, "Ew, that was so fast." And then she said she wasn't interested anymore. One day this girl grabbed another girl's hair and just like yanked it, right? And I was like, "Stop, please." And I went over and I said, "What is going on?" And the girl who did the aggressive yanking said, "I was watching Bluey and she closed my Chromebook." I mean, say less. Walking between classes and I saw a group of boys like huddled together, like all had something between their fingers, and somebody had a lighter in the center. And I'm like, in the broadest of daylights, really. So I went up and I said, "Hey, you guys." And they turned around and every single one of them was holding a dry spaghetti noodle betwixt their fingers. I was trying to get them to give me examples of words that weren't swear words, but not really phrases or words that we would use in a classroom environment. One of my students said, "Well, blue waffle." And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Google it." And I did. My students were reading choice books. That means they get to choose what they read at the beginning of class. One of my students finished her reading time and said, "Man, this book is leaving me swampy." And I said, What book are you reading?" She said, "Verity." This guy got back from the bathroom and he immediately yelled into the hallway, "This hickey better be gone before my girlfriend sees." Dude. Someone asked what an Alaskan pipeline is. It's not what I thought it was. This 8th grader was calling his friend a cuck, and the teacher thought that they were just really getting into Shakespearean lingo. And not realizing that's not where they got it. About 30 seconds after the student demonstrated that her water bottle was strong enough to stand on, a high schooler walked into class, said, "Nah, I'm still drunk from last night. I need to take a nap," and walked back out. Out loud? It's for different pipes. Students started an official feet-themed Instagram account for the whole school. I had a few former students reach out to me after I posted this. This one came from one of the students who I had my very first year teaching. He now is a very successful, like, mechanic car influencer type guy, and that really warmed my heart. And then I got this one. he used the right your. So. 10th grader held up his very blue hands and said, ugh, it looks like I just have a Smurf. No, thank you. The student said, Miss, I'm gonna buy a bunch of mustard. I'm gonna pour it into a bowl, and then I'm going to dip my butthole in it. The girl asked why her assignment smelled like Badosi. I know I'm gonna regret asking this, but what is Badosi? What is it? I stole some paint from a classroom that was getting redone and then took the paint and painted the principal's truck, which is a crime. So, student raised their hand and said, Miss, I know it says show your work at the top, but do I actually have to show my work? Teacher was like, yes. We said, well, I can tell that you didn't make this on a Google Doc, which means you probably stole it from somewhere, which means you didn't actually type in show your work. So I was just checking that you actually wanted that. Oh. Teacher passed out 2 donut holes to each child. And when one student received them, he said they look like 2 beautifully glazed testicles. Num, num, num. Some 4th grade boys have taken to calling it being nutmegged when someone, taps him in the junk. Which, why do you do that to each other? Why? It was raining outside, and so the teacher said, okay, guys, everybody put on your rain jackets. And a student said, I don't need a rain jacket. My skin is my rain jacket. Skin jacket. A kindergartner came out of the bathroom eating a urinal puck. Is that what it's called? What is it? Puck? That's not right. Cake. A urinal cake. It was announced that they were going to do a Halloween activity on the 31st. It was going to be super fun. And an 8th grade girl just moans from the back of the room, Daddy, but in like a sexual way. And I'm not doing that. So there you go. I told my students that they could bring anything that they wanted to read as long as they read it during their choice reading time. And so I had a student that brought a cereal box to read. And he still did not read it, but he did provide horse snack to everyone by just putting his whole fist into the cereal box. And I told my students we were going to the library and they would have to walk, not run. And so one of my students bent over and looked at his best friend and said, ride me, Daddy, but slowly. That's not. I was doing some direct instruction and kept getting interrupted. And so I told my students, I don't know why you're talking while I'm talking. And they said, because you won't stop. You do too much. Sometimes I like to bring my students out of the classroom and I would tell them beforehand, like, hey guys, wear good shoes. We're going to go on a little walkabout. And one of my students, actually most of my students, showed up in Crocs. And I was like, guys, what is the deal? I said wear good walking shoes. We're headed to the track. And one of my students said, Miss, it's fine. Sport mode. Thank God. 6th grade girl drew 6 phalluses nested, one within the other. Like a turducken. Or a turducken. The students were reading Act 4 of Romeo and Juliet, and when they finished, one of the students yelled out, Romeo tapped that. A 3rd grader was defining love and spelled comfort like this. The students were screaming, I got head. They were flipping coins. And they kept getting head. All class. In science class, the students were watching a video about groundhogs for Groundhog Day, as one does. And one of the students said, yo, that groundhog. They were talking about the perils of seasonal depression. So they started yelling, gotta get that D, back and forth to each other. Vitamin D from the sun. A student came up and said there was a no-no on the floor. It was a condom. A student opened a sext from another student that was also in my class when I was walking by, and I saw, and they saw, I saw, and then we all lived in that moment. One of my students showed up to class screaming that he was crowning because he had to poop. I had a student say, miss, just trust me. And I said, okay. And then he crawled out of my classroom window and just left. One of the girls in my class smacked my butt and said, "Batty with a fatty." Almost every day for a year, I had the same student try and vape my essential oil diffuser. It never worked. I told the students it was time to get ready to go and start the day, and they said, "That's racist." I once didn't make enough copies of something, and I told the student, "Sorry guys, it ran out." And one of my students looked at me and said, "Yep, just like my dad." Students broke the last 2 remaining toilets by trying to flush vapes. Hey, listen. I can't, stupid acrylics. Listen, stop flushing your vapes. Stop it. You're breaking all the toilets. Stop it. Today they studied The Great Gatsby. 6th grader threw up in the hall, and another 6th grader went to go open up his locker and stood in it. A 7th grader pooped on the floor in the hallway. Bro. Without breaking eye contact, a student took their little bell ringer paper and took a bite out of it. The bathroom walls were freshly decorated by some finger painting. Do you want to guess what they used? When admin sat down with the student and said, "Hey, I need you to check your attitude. Need to improve your attitude." And the student said, "You know what would improve my attitude? If you were on Ozempic."